Hello everybody and welcome to a special little video that I wanted to make today because we are going to be talking about Resident Evil 8, which is so far in the future that it probably seems absurd that we're even talking about it, especially because 7 came out 2 months ago in January, late January, so it's probably like, why would you make a video about this? But I do have a very good reason, because not too long ago, Capcom said that they already have plans in motion for Resident Evil 8 and sort of the direction that they want to go with the game, even though obviously there's nothing concrete with the game as far as story or anything goes. They sort of talked about kind of just a general overview of what they want the game to be like, and so I figure let's talk a little bit more about it and kind of talk about what we want to see in Resident Evil 8, because I loved Resident Evil 7 and I'm a huge fan of the franchise, and if they're already talking about it, then I already want to start talking about it. So that's what we're going to do today. And so to kind of start it off, I'll put the article on the screen and all that so you guys can kind of see a little bit of what it is too. But the main takeaway from it is they said that, as should be expected, it's going to be very similar to 7. And that kind of makes sense because when you look at the games and how they've worked, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 were all very similar. They all had that fixed camera angle and they all had sort of a focus on the survival aspect of things. They weren't super terrifying games. They did have a couple jump scares, but it was more about survival. Then you had 4, 5, and 6, which were the next 3 in the series, and those 3 are more action-based, right? All 3 of those games had a third-person over-the-camera angle shots. They all had an emphasis on action where there were tons of zombies coming at you. So those 3 were the same. The first 3 were the same. And so 7 is kind of, it sounds like it's going to be the start of a new trilogy. And they did mention that because in the interview and stuff, they were talking about how this is sort of the start of a new series and a new direction for Resident Evil. And so I don't know if the trilogy thing is on purpose or if it's just been an awkward coincidence, but I would imagine Resident Evil 8 and probably 9 too, even though that's extremely far down the road, those games will probably follow a very similar pattern to what 7 was like, which personally I think is a good thing, but we'll talk a little bit more about my opinion and stuff later. So obviously then we can assume that 8 will probably be a lot like 7. So what that means is it's probably going to be a first-person game again. We can imagine that because as we know, 7 was the first game in the franchise to be a first-person game. Personally, I thought that decision went over really well. I thought, even though it was a bit different, and I know a lot of hardcore Resident Evil fans weren't too happy about that decision, it worked well. And the game didn't feel like something it wasn't. My biggest fear is that it was going to feel less like Resident Evil and feel more like a game like Outlast, but that wasn't the case at all. It didn't feel like Outlast too much. There were a couple of jump scares and all that, but it felt like Resident Evil. It was still in a mansion. There were still deviations. You still had ammo and could fight back and kill things. It felt like the originals, it was just in a first-person angle, so that didn't bother me too much. So when they say it's going to be similar to Resident Evil 7, I imagine that's probably the biggest thing, is the first person, and then also the emphasis on horror, because if you've played 4, 5, and 6, those games weren't that scary. Again, there were like parts where zombies would kind of jump and it might freak you out, but there were no like actual psychological scares the way that there were in 7, because 7 did have a lot of parts where things would pop out of nowhere and kind of get you, or where you'd be kind of stressed because of ammo and stuff. There were a lot of like chase scenes too with the Jack Baker and Marguerite Baker, so there was a lot of fun stuff like that in Resident Evil 7 that we didn't see in the other games. So that stuff is a welcome return, but what was interesting to me in the interview is they did say there would be some major differences. So 8 is not going to be exactly like 7, and they try to make that pretty clear, I felt like, in the interview, when they said that some things are not going to be the same. There are going to be some noticeable changes from 8 to 7, that the foundation of the game will be the same, but there will be different elements in the game. And so I was trying to think what different things could possibly change from 7 to 8. And I think an obvious one, I have 3 main things. So we'll start with the first one, is scenery. So the first game essentially took place in the whole mansion, right? It was essentially the Baker residence. I guess it wasn't a mansion, but it was the Baker residence. And then a couple times you go out to other places. I don't want to spoil the game for people that haven't played it, but there are places outside of the mansion you will go to. One of the early ones is the guest house that you visit. I think that's pretty much at the beginning of the game, so that's not a huge spoiler. But so there's that area. This is ironically very similar to 1, where in 1 you spent the whole time in the Spencer mansion, and then you sort of branch out and deviate from there, and you go to I can spoil that game because that game's kind of old. You go to a laboratory, you go to a guest house, and you get the log cabin in that game with Lisa Trevor and all that. So that game and 7 were kind of the same. And so as far as scenery differences go, I imagine it's going to be kind of like 2, where maybe in Resident Evil 8, you'll spend more time in sort of the city around it, because the game made it clear things aren't that amazing in the world, that clearly there's still problems with the virus, and so obviously there's going to be a different setting. I would also imagine the enemies would be different. So this part might be a little bit of a spoiler, but I'm going to assume everyone did see Resident Evil 7. I know I just said no spoilers, but I have to spoil it for this part. The enemies will probably be different, and that's for a very obvious reason, right? Because Evelyn, who is the main villain in the game, was infected with the E virus, and the E virus is what caused her to vomit the molded. And so if Evelyn is gone, I would imagine that molded creature would also be gone as well. Now, I don't know, because I try to look through the documents and see what there is in the game and stuff. I don't know if other people around the country have also been infected with this. It didn't make too many mentions except for a couple of failed experiments. But I would imagine that the E virus probably didn't spread too much, which means that the other enemies or other areas of the game are probably going to be infected with a different virus. And as we've seen in the past with Resident Evil, different viruses mean different enemies. And this is a good thing, because as cool as the molded were, it was kind of repetitive, because the only real difference in enemies were the molded and then the four-legged molded. Outside of that, there weren't many other enemies, except for like the bugs and stuff, but those barely count. So those are two of the main changes I expect to see, and then the third one is I also expect there to be main character changes. No two Resident Evil games have ever had the same protagonist in a row. I'm trying to think about that in my head, and I'm pretty sure what I said is accurate. Where they switched it up every time. So the first game had like Jill and Chris, and then the second game had Leon and Claire, and then the third game had Jill and Carlos, and so it always switches, you know, and then the fourth had Leon and Ashley, so it constantly switches when you go from one game to the next. And so even though Ethan and Mia were cool and they're new characters, I can't imagine they're going to be in Resident Evil 8 as the main characters. I'm imagining they're probably going to play a pretty important role. We don't even have all the details yet because we still need that Chris Redfield DLC, that Not a Hero DLC that's supposed to come out. So I don't even want to talk about the story too much until we get that and fully figure out what's going on in this world and what's up with Umbrella and all that. But I would imagine Ethan and Mia's story is not over, but I can't imagine they'll be the main characters. It's probably going to be something related to what happened with them, especially with, you know, because Mia Winters had her whole undercover thing on the ship with Evelyn. I'd imagine maybe there'll be some characters that are related to that incident. But my hope is that they'll still be somewhat normal characters. It was kind of nice to play as two characters that don't really have a lot of combat military experience, because Chris and Jill and even like Rebecca and all those people from the older games were all STARS members, or members of like the military or higher up people. So it was kind of cool seeing a bunch of characters that, you know, were just kind of normal people that were put in a bad situation. And so the main characters I think will be different, which is one of the differences they're talking about, but I'd imagine for the most part, they'll be the same type of character, or at least that's what I'm hoping for. And so I think those will be the three main areas of difference in the game, but I think that the main mechanics will still be the same, and that's what I'm hoping for. And I know, again, that's kind of an area of controversy, and I'm curious what you guys think too, but I personally really liked the first-person shooter perspective. I thought the way that 7 did it was perfect, because like I said, even though it was first-person, which is a new thing, Resident Evil has never had a consistent camera frame. I mean, the camera angle thing only lasted until 3, the fixed camera. After that, it did switch to the third person over the shoulder. And that third person was in 4, and 4 is a lot of people's favorite, so it's like, well, I don't feel like we can say it's not Resident Evil because of first person, because Resident Evil switches up their camera angle a lot, so we'll see. So that's something I hope to stay the same. So to summarize, I hope the first person camera stays, I hope this horror aspect stays, because the way they did horror in this game was great. There weren't a lot of jump scares, but they mixed up the few jump scares there were with a lot of just suspense and despair, which I liked. So that was cool. So those two things should stay. And then the main differences will probably be with like the scenery, the characters, and the enemy. So that's what I'm hoping for. There's not a whole lot to say. Again, they didn't talk a whole lot about it. I think once the DLC comes out and more information comes out, I'll probably make another video about this because I like talking about Resident Evil. It's one of my favorite franchises, and so you can definitely expect to see more of this. This was sort of just a general overview of what they said and the similarities and differences that I'm expecting to see in it, but we'll definitely be having this conversation again later. So let me know what you guys think, what you would like to see in a game like Resident Evil 8, if you kind of want to see the first-person style again, or if you kind of miss the action, or whatever you like in a Resident Evil game. I'd love to hear what you guys want to see in the comment section below. I will see you guys later. Bye-bye.